Okay, great.
Are we ready?
Yeah, let's go.
Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this DPAC meeting on the social model of disability. My name is Sarah. I've been involved with DPAC for a while, and I'm also currently a member of the Labour Party and involved in my local Disabled Members Forum with them. Thank you to Mark for sharing the first half so well, and I'm going to take us through the second half now. I'll go straight to our first speaker, who is Kate Carrier. Kate is a founding member of the Unspoken Project and a CIC and AAC user. So I'll hand over to Kate.
I believe the social model is the most powerful tool that we disabled people have in our arsenal, both for ourselves, because it makes us realize that we are not the problem because we have impairments, but also for us to change the world. Social model thinking unites us in ways that having the same impairments does not. An example of this is that the person who I find really thinks along the same lines as me about being disabled has the opposite impairments. I have trouble getting the words out, and she can't stop the words coming out. But we can have conversations about what it means to be disabled. Whereas I find other people who have to use communication technology are mostly stuck in that world built by non-disabled people trying to be PC, where they say, your disability doesn't define you. You can do anything if you put your mind to it, and you are such an inspiration, etc., etc. You know how it goes. The problem is so many disabled people don't know what the social model is. Yes, they might have heard the term, but their understanding of it is so limited. They talk about themselves as people with disabilities, thus not really understanding the difference between impairment and disability, as explained by UPIS. UPIS is an earth-shattering and groundbreaking concept, as Ellen described it, is coming up for 50 years old in this new decade, but I think the social model's power has never been more needed. I have heard disabled communication aid users say they suffer from disability and go into the horrible warrior narrative. For example, I'm a CP warrior fighting against cerebral palsy. I get the impression that communication aid using people seem less political than other disabled people. I'm also sorry to say we are somehow overlooked by the disability movement, maybe because there is not that many of us. This brings me on to Ellen's next question, which is, why some people don't identify under the social model. As I have said, I feel that people without speech are less aware of disability politics, with possibly one exception, which is the growing number of political autistic people. I find autistic people are starting to get political and vocal against organizations run by non-disabled people, and this includes autistic augmentative and alternative communication users. Having said that, I believe people with severe communication impairments are not usually engaged in disability politics, so they don't have access to radical ideas like the social model. This is because non-disabled professionals, speech therapists, and special school teachers have a stranglehold over the provision of communication aids and the instructing in how to use them. And they have set up organizations to defend their own professional interests that treat disabled AAC users in the paternalistic way that we all recognize in the disability charities. With the social model, we can change this patronizing world, but too many young people are sucked into the old paradigm of regarding disability as something to be ashamed of. I have met many non-speaking kids who are ashamed of having a communication aid because they say it makes them look disabled. We need the social model to save them. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kate. That was great. I think thinking about having everyone having access to radical ideas is something that's really important for all of us. So our next speaker is Rick Burgess. Rick is part of Recovery in the Bin, as well as Manchester DPAC and the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People. So I will hand over to Rick now.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. So the great thing about coming on at this point in the evening is everyone's already said loads of important things. The bad thing is that means, what have I got to say? But when I read this last chapters of Ellen's book, as I said to her, it's like she's managed to thread a careful path through what could be a minefield in talking about the social model and how we might reinvigorate it, for want of a better word. And it mirrored a lot of the discussions that we've already had. And I think a lot of other people have had as we sort of continued with activism and organizing and stuff. That being able to tell people about the social model, so often they would say, well, it doesn't work for me, or that doesn't apply to me. So we had to find ways to sort of meet them where they are, to meet them with their language, and then try and talk about how it might apply, or they might realize and see the possibilities in it. And I think what Ellen has sort of summarized is a really effective way of us starting to think about that. It is necessary. What we've seen, obviously over the last 10, actually more than 10 years, is as a wholesale assault on our rights and on our very lives. And to be horrifically utilitarian about it, basically, we need as big a movement as possible. And so if that movement can include as many people as possible who share similar oppressions, I think that's something we need to be doing. And I think as well, we also have to realize that other models, other ways of looking at things, sort of, I know we talked about it's really the medical model is part of the individual model, but broadly I often say that there's a charity model, there's an inspiration model, there's a medical model. There's lots of very well-resourced institutions with good incentive to ignore us and to put their model in our place. Our model is the one that we thought of, that we figured out based on our lives. And I think one of the sort of first lesson of it, absolutely, which I think is a great selling point to everybody, is nothing about us without us. It is our model. We run our organizations, and we say what we need to say about how we want the model to reflect how our life and our experiences are. Language is difficult. We all kind of argue over different bits of the language of it. Impairment is not a great word. If anything, we need to invent or find a new word. But we do need to do that outreach. We need to get out and we need to get this idea to more people, because it is a very, very, very powerful liberation tool. And it's revelatory to people. When they get it, you kind of go, ah, it is fantastic. And then they start really thinking stuff and start organizing stuff themselves. And that's what we need. We really do need to get out there and to spread this idea. So this is very important. We're starting to have this discussion. And I think the chapter in the book is a really good summation of, I think a lot of people have been saying this. And as you've seen before this evening, a lot of, the Chronic Illness Inclusion Project, the deaf community, autistic, neurodiverse people, people with mental distress, where in Recovery in the Bin, we've always said we wanted a robust social model of mental distress, but it will have to have nuances. It will have to have some differences, but the commonalities, the majority of our oppressions are the same. And I think if we can just talk about this, agree where we agree, and discuss where we're going to disagree, but not get stupid or angry about it, I think we can actually start to build for the next decade, which unfortunately looks like it's still going to be very, very hard, particularly after the impact of COVID, where we've died absolutely, you know, outrageously high rates. 2/3 of the fatalities appear to be disabled people. So I think it's important we have this discussion. It's important we do reach out, and the people that haven't felt included, we should listen to them and then explain what we think we can do and change and reinvigorate the model so that they do feel represented and included in it. Because I think something that's almost 50 years old probably does need a little bit of dusting off. And I do think we've got also other powerful tools as activists. Intersectionality is a hugely fantastic tool as well. And I think that also has implications for how we think about the social model. So this is a great start at the beginning of this decade. Unfortunately, we do need it. We've got a long way to go. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. That was great. I think, like, I totally agree. Bringing in as many people as possible and being open to as many people as possible is really, really important. Our next speaker is Andrew Lee. Andrew is the Director of People First Self-Advocacy, and I'll hand over to him now.
Hello. Right. Listening to everybody has been really interesting. One of the things that I think is kind of really important to notice is that we have lots of laws, but I don't think that they're actually enforced correctly. And I don't actually think that the bodies that are kind of set up are brave enough to actually use the powers that they have. So I'd like to actually see some movement on that. I also think that when our issues are talked about, the media automatically turn to the big charities, and I hate that with a passion. It's a bit like actually asking a bloke to actually talk to them about women's issues, or someone from the BME community to actually talk about women's issue, to talk about what it's like to be white. That's just not right. I think it's important, though, that there are lots of barriers that people with learning difficulties face, which is information and power. Information is power. If it's not in the format that meets your access needs, you haven't got any power. And the people that control that flow of information are the people that actually have power. So if you can't read and you can't write, you're fighting to actually get heard. And so I felt this from 7 to 22 when I joined the self-advocacy movement. I felt that the world was actually, I was battling against the world. It was just me on my own, and the family, and I had experiences at home that actually meant that I had to kind of go out and prove that I could do it, even if I had to do those things in secret, just to show that I could do it, especially if I'd actually been told that I couldn't do it because I had a learning difficulty. And I internalized lots of anger, lots of frustration. And so I used that anger and that frustration to actually prove to people that weren't wrong, even the people that were kind of closest to me. And I'm sure lots of people with learning difficulties feel the same way. We're actually going into a big more kind of digital world, and yet we can't even get information in a format that meets our access needs, and so we need support to actually ask for that information. When people put documents into Easy Read, they take out all the little bits and pieces that are actually important. This was demonstrated when we did the mental capacity medical model of, when we did the Mental Capacity Act. People with learning difficulties read the Easy Read version, and our supporters read the main jargon. We came up with two completely different sources, two different actual answers. Why? Because the actual information had actually been taken, the important information had been taken out. And so it's like society is actually frightened of us actually having the same amount of information to ask for us to make decisions for us, decisions for ourselves. Choice, control, independence. We all have the same aspirations as people without a disability, but we actually have to prove ourselves before we're even allowed onto the racetrack to actually join the race of society, and that's not fair. I think that moving forward, there are two things that can be done really importantly. One is that we ask DPAC and every user-led disability movement to turn around to the organizations that are not run and controlled by disabled people, or run and controlled by people with lived experience, and say, they don't speak for us, they speak for parents, or they speak for people without who are in a supporting role. Let's say parents are in a supporting role. Each time society refers to a relative as carer, hello, you're not, you're my mom, you're my dad, you're my sister, you're my brother. That's actually how we see things. Okay, and they're doing it now, even with young relatives. The reason why families are in such a hole is because society hasn't actually changed properly. Society actually hasn't actually realized that that because you haven't actually funded social care properly for decades, almost all of my lifetime, that's the problem. You don't respect the social care system in the same way as you recognize the NHS. And people with learning difficulties would really prefer to live in their own place with their own support that they need, and actually have the support that they need to go rock climbing, bungee jumping. And for God's sake, actually make sure that I understand that we have a political point of view. It isn't all just kind of focused on disability. We see the world from our own perspective. We have dreams, aspirations. We want to get married, have a family, live in our own place. And yet I have friends that actually have been stopped by society just for being themselves, and it's got to stop. And so the challenge for the 21st century is that everybody that is marginalized, everybody that is actually cut off, we can, if we come together as one unit, we can take on society. In the words of Barack Obama, yes, we bloody well can. And I really like Ellen's book. Thanks, Ellen, for doing the book. You've given us a starting point.
That was great. Thank you so much, Andrew. I think speaking for ourselves rather than having people speak for us is fundamental, really. We're not going to get anywhere without that. So our next speaker is Paul Ntulila. Paul is a deaf campaigner, and I'll hand over to him now.
Hello, sorry, I was just checking the interpreter could see me. Hello, good evening all. And firstly, I would just like to thank and congratulate Ellen on her book and for inviting me to speak tonight. So congratulations on your book, The War on Disabled People. It's just fantastic. The first point I'd like to make is that the social model of disability is needed. It helps highlight to those that don't understand what we go through, that we are not limiting ourselves, but that society and its barriers are. We need a clear model to be able to influence change in government and also other medical institutions. So for people that don't know, it just helps. It helps us explain that to them. And it also helps to be able to change things politically. The model, I think, does need refreshing as society has moved on. Some attitudes have improved, others have got worse. So, for example, the government cuts have now created more and more barriers. I think the model needs to be refreshed. As a deaf person myself, I'm aware of the contrast and difference between deaf people and disability, and it feels almost like there's two camps. The third point I'd like to make is, from reading Ellen's initial thoughts, I would say I fully agree that we need to come together more collectively and not to be seen as individual problems. Discrimination and cuts are just two examples of more systemic forces that aren't from disabled people, and I don't think they can be solved individually. I'm in agreement that the model will never be perfect. For some people, I think it's easier to get into action, but they ignore the theories because they just feel it's too heavy a read. But when actually those can reinforce the actions. I appreciate the sentiment of trying to define impairment, but I still find the word itself difficult. For example, hearing impairment, that implies damage. I would prefer to find an alternative word around this concept. So for me, the next steps would include ways that we can make sure the social model can be applied and talked about in relevant, real-world applicable ways, particularly if working outside of DDPOs. That's it from me. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Paul. Yeah, that's given me lots to think about, thinking about alternative words to impairment. It's really interesting. So our next speaker is Dorothy Gould, and Dorothy is from Liberation. Over to you, Dorothy.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. I'm someone with lived experience of mental trauma. I've used mental health services and very much regard myself as a survivor of them. I could talk for a long time about the social model, but here are a few key points I'd like to make. To me and many of my peers, a social model is very important because it challenges the whole idea that the only way to understand mental distress, mental trauma, is by an individual illness model. For many of us, this model just doesn't fit our personal experiences. It's worrying as well that the model remains dominant, despite the major holes that have emerged in what's said to be scientific evidence that our difficulties are illnesses, in just the same way that physical health problems are, and that psychiatric drugs are effective. At the same time, many of us have had concerns about the social model as it's been put forward or understood so far. One key issue has been establishing, even among some other disabled, that the social model's call for independent living means an end to detaining us in psychiatric hospitals against our will and forcibly treating us under mental health law. It's quite often as if the latter is not thought to need a focus, that it doesn't matter that that's happening to us, or to be acceptable for us, even though it wouldn't be for other people. Many of us also have a problem with the concept that our mental distress, our mental trauma is an impairment, as Ellen has acknowledged in the War on Disabled People. That's not because we want to deny the experiences of mental health service user colleagues who believe there is some medical component to their difficulties. It's because many of us, including me, experience our mental distress, our mental trauma, as coming from the nature of society itself, not from any intrinsic impairment, and as being an ordinary human reaction to inequalities, injustice, and abuse in society. Why should we then be treated as if there's something wrong with us? We want a social model which is wide enough to embrace our identity as well. I'd suggest that the priority need is an in-depth and imaginative conceptualization of the meaning of a social model, so that the model is broad enough to encompass those of us who have had some problems with typical current presentations. For example, I like Ellen's suggestion of also thinking about a social model of impairment. If we don't have this imaginative conceptualization, joint action just won't be effective in the way it needs to be, neither between disabled people as a whole, nor between us and others who are facing major inequality and injustice as well. And at a time when we're all facing that, when we're more oppressed than ever and need more than ever to work together, the coronavirus outbreak couldn't have made it clearer. I agree with Ellen that both capitalism and the individualism which is intrinsic to it play a huge part in the ongoing oppression of disabled people and of others who've been consistently disadvantaged and oppressed. I'd also be very interested in seeing an exploration of issues which Ellen has raised in the context of non-capitalist countries and countries with a community ethos as opposed to an individualistic one. Increased understanding of issues for international colleagues and campaigning with them as well would be tremendous. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dorothy. And I think sort of making international links is something that's going to come up in the next one of these meetings, but I'll talk about that a bit more at the end. So our last speaker is Naomi Care. Naomi is from Strive UK, and after Naomi's finished, we'll hand back to Ellen to talk a bit about next steps. So over to you, Naomi.
Thank you. I'm aware that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and without the work of previous disability activists who developed the social model, I would not have been able to enjoy the many opportunities in terms of work and education that I've enjoyed. But however, as a person with a chronic illness, I've never felt at home with the social model of disability. For years, I was housebound due to fatigue and pain. I was unable to access work or education, or even really maintain any sort of social life. And during this time, I was jointly disabled, not just by society, but also by my impairment. By society, I was disabled by the benefit system that required endless paperwork and meetings for me to prove I was adequately disabled. I was disabled by a society that at the time was unable to create social or learning opportunities in my home, which we've since found with the COVID pandemic is more than achievable for people like me. And I was disabled by a society that valued work and production over my many other contributions. But I was also disabled by my body that would not allow me to get out of bed, to eat, to focus on a conversation. There are times that no amount of barrier removal would have been adequate to include me. And this is something that's really important to consider. At Strive UK, we are working with young adults with chronic illnesses to campaign for better opportunities for their futures. Many of these young adults are unaware of the social model of disability. They're not aware of their rights in society, and many of them question whether they can even claim to be disabled despite the difficulties they face. They don't feel that these are enough, that they need to have something more to be considered part of the club. However, even those of us who are aware of our rights face disbelief and skepticism from those around us. At the moment, many bits of government policy use the pseudo sort of social model of disability. They talk about reasonable adjustments and access arrangements in its guise. And we're often almost punished with this. We're told that the reasonable adjustments offered to us should be enough, even though they have not been created by people who understand chronic illnesses and are not sufficient to help us be included in society. By ignoring the intrinsic suffering that comes with chronic illnesses, barrier removal often fails to help. So then, what is the future for us? I love that this is a collaborative session with so many different people from so many different backgrounds. I think that is essential for moving forward. For me, I've always felt much more at home in the capability model that looks at wealth sort of in terms of opportunities. So what opportunities can you access? Are you able to get to work? Are you able to access education? What is available to you? And for me, I think that more adequately sums up my disability, because at times I haven't been able to access any of that, even down to being able to see my friends for coffee. So in the future, I would really like it if chronic illnesses were considered and really understood in terms of their day-to-day suffering and how they can completely disable a person one day, and the next day that person may be able to come out and help and do all the things they normally can do. I don't have a problem with the word impairment. My body is a little bit broken, but it's also amazing in so many other ways. And I feel that that makes me stronger as a person. I would be very sad if the word impairment disappeared completely, because it does encapsulate my experience. Lastly, I'm very aware that the medical profession has caused much harm to many people with chronic illnesses and other disabilities. But during the time when I was most unwell, they were the ones that advocated for me. They were the ones that found treatments for me, and they were the ones that ultimately made me feel better. I would encourage us to consult those members of the medical profession who are sympathetic, who do understand, and who are fighting for us, because the medical model, though incredibly problematic, also can help some people in certain situations, such as myself. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Naomi. And I'm going to go straight on to Ellen to wrap up.
Sorry, Sarah, I could probably have just gone on without you having to pop in, but nice to see you. I think that was a really amazing discussion, and I think it really proved to me why we're so much better as a collective, and how important it is to hear as many voices as possible. I think that what I was originally envisaging has just got a whole lot bigger. Very taken by the ideas that, that we need to go out there, as Rick Burgess said, that, we need to be taking the social model to people and finding out the views of people beyond what is effectively, our own bubble here. And Dorothy was talking about researching other societies that are underpinned by different political ideas and how they treat disabled people. So yeah, I think it's got a whole lot bigger, but I was just quite overwhelmed actually by just how much thought people have put into their contributions and all the ideas that surfaced today. And I know that people watching will have had similarly very thought-provoking ideas. So the next step is to try and pull something together to take this forwards, because this is just, the beginning of a discussion. We need further follow-up discussions. I think there is a consensus that was established tonight about the need to do some work on this, to look at the barriers that have stopped specific groups from getting involved, and some of the reasons are actually in direct contradiction with each other. So we have groups of people who have been very oppressed by the medicalisation of disability, and then other groups who have been invalidated and denied the medicalisation that actually they need to improve their lives. But actually, I think that there is an umbrella under which we can all sit, and I think there is a desire for us to have a platform in which we can unite, and we can resist our shared oppression together. I really took heart that this is something that people want to get involved in. But of course, it's no good talking about the importance of praxis, of the importance of activity, if we don't actually do it. So I will end on saying that, of course, we need to not lose focus on activity. The situation facing disabled people globally at the moment with the pandemic is particularly worrying. We had 10 years of welfare reform and austerity, and we thought things were bad. And then COVID came along and really starkly highlighted the way that disabled people are viewed in society. We're going to have, Sarah will tell you more, but next week's meeting, online DPAC meeting, we'll bring together disabled activists from across the world to talk about the situation that we are now facing and how we can resist that. And we mustn't lose our focus on action. In particular, at the moment, DPAC is campaigning against the reintroduction of conditionality and sanctions. So that was temporarily paused by the government for 3 months. That ended on June the 30th. They're now trying to reopen job centres this week. PCS Union is trying to oppose that. DPAC had a day of online action last week. We want to continue fighting against that. We know that conditionality and sanctions aren't just cruel during a pandemic, but there's no place for them in the social security system. They've been proven to discriminate against disabled people. So please join in that, which is part of our wider campaign against universal credit. And then I think the disabled community also need to take stock of the fact that eugenics is resurfacing. Johnson and Cummings' initial plan to use a herd immunity strategy for dealing with COVID-19 is an expression of eugenic ideas. And next week, we're going to hear from a campaigner from Sweden about how their government's response is even more deeply informed by a eugenics approach. The rise of the far right across Europe is a danger here in the UK too, particularly if another recession hits after the pandemic, I think we have to think about a eugenics ideology resurfacing again for activism to be effective and to lead towards the kind of social change we need to end all forms of oppression. It needs to be underpinned by theory. So we do need to get that straight, but we also need to be prepared to take action, to resist and to fight for a society, not just where disabled people's oppression ends, but where all forms of oppression are ended. So thanks for everyone for taking the time to take part tonight, and onwards in the struggle.
Great, thank you, Ellen, and thank you for giving us so much to think about and hopefully get stuck into. So I'd just like to thank all our speakers again, also our interpreters and palantypists, so that's Sam, Nikki, Norma and Julia, and also behind the scenes doing lots of work, Ellen and Catherine as well. And thanks to all of you for coming along and taking part. So I'll just say a bit more about the next meeting. That's next Monday, the 13th. And it's on eugenics, COVID-19 and international solidarity. So we have an amazing lineup of speakers from Greece, Uganda, Sweden, as Ellen mentioned, Bulgaria, Belgium, the US, Hungary, Bolivia, and more. We'll be comparing the experiences of disabled people under COVID-19 and looking at the links between our treatment and eugenics, as well as looking at how we can build a stronger global resistance against the oppression of disabled people. So thank you all again for coming, and hopefully we will see you there next week. Good night.